And we are live. This is Dark Journalists. What a fantastic crowd we have out there with us tonight already. And although we don't have the lovely Olivia with us tonight, we do. We've got, hold on just a moment. And a little technical fun for everyone. So we don't have the lovely Olivia with us, but we do, in fact, have Carolyn Kat Goida running the ideas room out there, and which is sensational, and we're very happy to have her out there doing it. And of course, we're going to be back next week with the X series, but tonight is a very special report dealing with the very important issue of the JFK records being blocked. And that was a little bit of a major snafu back during the Trump administration, because these things had been technically set back as far as 1992, which was 25 years now, when they were supposed to be set, from 92 to 2017, October 26th. Of course, now it's 4 years past that, and they're still not out. So we have to kind of keep that in mind. One of the things I do want to stress is that these records were mandated by law in 1992 to come out, and they are records specifically dealing with the hidden aspects that the CIA was engaged in during the Kennedy presidency, which has a tremendous bearing on his assassination there some 58 years ago, come November 22nd. So this is one of those kind of crucial pieces. And what happened was on October 26, 2017, I was live streaming because all those records were supposed to come out under Trump, and we were going to learn the CIA's role, etc. That morning, the CIA and the FBI director went into Trump's office and just gave him a tremendous hard time about the release of the files. And so he released some, but he left out some very, very crucial details, and the CIA got to keep 70% of their files, which is a complete disgrace, considering it was mandated by law in 92, and that was already some 30 years after the crime itself. So you have to wonder, when you get into those kind of headspaces, what were they hiding, for example? And so we have to kind of keep that in mind as we go through this here, because one of the things I want to stress is that right off the bat, there was a cover-up and a secondary story. And then there was a third story on top of that. So we're going to go through some of those stories, and we're also going to see what the real key was in all of it, which is that it related to aerospace. Nonetheless, it's a crime on record, and the CIA is still covering up. And now the Biden administration is joining in that cover-up of the assassination of President Kennedy and the role of the Central Intelligence Agency in it, by going the extra mile and saying, well, actually, it's this COVID stuff that is preventing us from releasing any records, which is absurd, because you could just digitize them and put them online and the whole thing's over. So they're lying, and the CIA is lying. Now, anyone who's done any real kind of deep research on it sees the CIA fingerprints all over the assassination of Kennedy, who was at war with the Central Intelligence Agency all during his presidency. We're going to get into what the CIA was, what it became, and how it came to be in the first place. Because, you know, President Truman, when he set out to put it up, he said, well, I don't want an American Gestapo, but that's what he got, unfortunately. We're going to be definitely going deep on the aerospace piece, and also on the actual official record in the National Archives that the Biden administration is hiding, and the records that are in court from the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, hiding behind a phalanx of lawyers to try, just a gauntlet there for these journalists who are still trying to get some of those answers in relation to the CIA's role. Now, I've never thought there would be a smoking gun in the files for the John F. Kennedy assassination in the CIA files. However, every time they release something, there's a network there. There are enough pieces, for example, the Jim Garrison files, showing that the CIA set up the New Orleans DA who was investigating the crime. And the fact that Garrison, who was the New Orleans DA who investigated and put Clay Shaw on trial for the JFK assassination and was disrupted by the CIA and the media, really destroyed him, who was immortalized in the Oliver Stone film. And Oliver's going to come up tonight as well. There's something really interesting about this because what I want to say about Garrison's role is that when he was knocking into things during his investigation, he was knocking into aerospace. And in the beginning, he didn't actually understand what that was. He came to understand it and put it on the record. But it is a dramatic piece. And I've done now a couple of documentaries on this case. Agent Oswald, the CIA patsy, is the central piece about the CIA setup of Oswald, and they're working with him for years to be the patsy for this crime. And it also gets into, the real media cover-up aspect. The other one that I did was called X-Protect, the UFO File Assassins. That has the Kennedy murders, and it has the greater Lockheed Martin role. You have to understand when you go into the assassinations and when you go into the political aspects, you're going to find yourself staring face to face with hidden aerospace over and over again. That's what I learned. And so I found when people were really good experts, some of these deep state researchers, they're so good, and they make the UFO field look ridiculous because in the UFO field, seems like all they want to do is have a campfire with the CIA and pray that the CIA will give them disclosure so they can go on, CBS News and talk about it. So you got a really pathetic field on the UFO side. I want to mention the UFO side in relation to this political aspect and the secret space program, because that's the angle that we come in on with this, because that's where the research leads, in fact. Right up to the relationship that JFK had with James Forrestal, who was the first defense secretary, and he was killed because his knowledge of the UFO file. You cannot get around that UFO piece when you're dealing with this deep state assassination part, because very often what we're looking at is deep state assassinations. They have a lethal capability to guard certain secrets. The UFO file is the biggest secret. And not simply because it relates to an alien presence, although I'm sure that's a big piece of it. They're trying to promote that now. But it is the X technology that resides inside the UFO file, and this is the crucial aspect, because it represents a technology that could give someone else an advantage and therefore threaten their position and their kind of hegemony over the globe and beyond. So there are aspects inside that UFO file that I've referred to as apotheum, which are kind of physical, it's like a physics reality distortion field. And this gets into that deep aspect. And we're going to find that this is absolutely documented if you know where to look. And we're also going to find that somehow when you get around the JFK assassination, or if you get around Oswald, or if you get around Bell Helicopter, you're surrounded by the aerospace industry. You're surrounded by former Nazis, and you're surrounded by the UFO file. This is what Garrison learned and was very confused by in the 1960s, because he realized, okay, I'm dealing with this major aspect that has to do with aerospace, and I can see the CIA influence. But what's this? Why is it when I go to show up at Oswald's job that he supposedly was claiming he was going, which was Riley Coffee Company was the job, that Oswald claimed, well, I'm going to NASA. This is what he was telling all his friends. I got this great job at NASA. And all of his friends who were working there at Riley Coffee Company ended up being part of the aerospace industry, mostly through NASA or Lockheed Martin. And this is the remarkable thing. It also happens when we get into the JFK assassination piece. We'll find whenever they've reopened the investigation, and there have been 5, whenever they get around it, there's a list of deaths associated each time. Originally with the Warren Commission. And, it's a very interesting factoid that they made a movie called Executive Action in 1972, and it was all about the Central Intelligence Agency taking out President Kennedy. And it was in the air there. They understood it a little bit better than we did later. And one of the key things that comes up is at the end, they go through the witnesses and how many of them died. And it would be like, died by karate chop, killed by a hunting rifle, and all in a very short period of about 5 years. And then, so what happened was somebody engaged kind of a bet maker out there in the UK to say, what are the odds that all these people would die in that frame of time and have these violent deaths? Just, even by natural causes, what would the odds be? And the bookmaker came back and gave them the odds of 100,000 trillion to 1. So when you get around these things, you have to understand the group that I call X-Protect. You could just say a lethal arm of the CIA or the cover-up arm. But the X-Protect group protects the X technology and the UFO piece. And they're, anything that has to do with that side of their power base in aerospace, and certainly the assassination of President Kennedy does. So let's look just on the record. We'll go back from the events that happened today and yesterday, where Biden came out and said, I'm not releasing these records, which is against the law because they're mandated by law to come out. Since 1992, it says you got 25 years to release them all. That was 2017. Trump released some, got talked into by the CIA director. Oh, this is going to hurt personnel or whatever. Look, who are you going to have in the field that was operating 60 years ago? And most of those countries don't even exist. The Soviet Union's gone. So the idea that this would be some kind of national security issue is beyond absurd. And we're going to see that. But I thought the explanations they were giving were quite interesting. Just to pull in that whole COVID piece, no matter what. So anything that comes up, if there's an earthquake, well, it was a COVID buildup. It was all these masks, and they caused a kind of curve the earth, and we got earthquakes. I mean, they'll just make up anything to roll COVID into it at this point. There it is. White House further postpones disclosure of JFK assassination documents citing COVID. I kid you not. This is their line. They're saying we're going to delay the release of the JFK assassination records because of COVID. So we have to kind of get our heads wrapped around that. There's no real explanation. Even the New York Times, which is, so in Biden's corner that you can't even tell the difference between the Biden administration and the reporters there. But even they were like, they didn't exactly kind of make the case for how the pandemic stuff had anything to do with this. Here we go. New York Times. Biden delays the release of remaining JFK assassination records, citing the pandemic. We'll use any excuse to keep the investigation off of the CIA, which is where it belongs because of their involvement. Who holds the most records back, the most important records also? Well, 70% of the JFK assassination records are the CIA's records. So, they're keeping thousands of files. And like I said, there's not going to be a clear-cut line that says the CIA ordered the assassination of President Kennedy in there. But there's enough, and they've learned this. There's enough of the connecting the dots that leaves them in a mess. Because, for example, when Trump released in 2016 some of these files, 2017, one of the things that came out was that the mayor of Dallas, who set up the parade route, was also, he was the brother of General Cabell, who was the deputy CIA director. But what we also found out is that he was a CIA operative. So that had never come out in that whole period of time, 54 years. And this is crucial because the person who lays out the ambush is a CIA asset that instantly in an investigation would have been crucial. None of that stuff came to the Warren Commission. The Warren Commission was just one of those strange jokes. Went on, for close to a year. And then when they came out, it had all these important people on it, and some of them got rewarded later with becoming president, like Gerald Ford, who was really a lowly Michigan congressman at the time, and Chief Justice Earl Warren. But the Warren report left out anything that was important. And Allen Dulles, who was the CIA director that JFK had fired because he tried to set off all these different wars around the planet, but specifically in Cuba. And, JFK became very aware of the status that he had. And so this is one of the main problems when we get into this, is that Kennedy fires Dulles, and Dulles has been there with his brother for a decade, controlling everything. And before that, setting up the national security state in the 40s. And he's a Wall Street lawyer. I mean, we have to remember that's how the CIA got its start. Wall Street lawyers set this thing up to represent international business interests out of New York. That's what we're talking about. President Truman wanted it as simply, a brain trust that would give intelligence to the president about hotbeds, and sort of hotspots around the globe relating to foreign intervention and all the rest. That's it. That was their actual role. Now they have their own Air Force. They control the media completely. As we know, they set up an entire plan to assassinate dissidents like Julian Assange. That came out. Even the New York Times and the Washington Post and people like that had a report on that. So the CIA is still engaged in the business of assassination. They never stop. Their power has grown so dramatically that, if you think about Kennedy being concerned about it in 1961, think about where we are now, 58 years after his assassination, and how far it's grown, and nothing's been able to stop it. As a matter of fact, we've had CIA directors as presidents. Just ask George H.W. Bush in The Great Beyond. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist special report. We're here dissecting the news that the Biden administration is not going to release the CIA records on the JFK assassination, citing the pandemic. It's science, don't you know, that you don't get the JFK assassination records. I think this action, though, does show that they're still trying to keep that line that the CIA didn't kill President Kennedy. They're still trying to stick to that, and they can't, when the records come out, the way that the information circulates now, they're not in a position where they feel like they can afford to have even this kind of information come out. So we're not going to be taking questions in this episode, but when we come back next week, we will be doing that. I'm going to lay out what they had there in terms of their excuse for this report, and then lay out some key elements that have been coming up in relation to the JFK assassination. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter there with the incredible censorship that we've been watching, just, completely over the top. And this is the nature of where we've arrived in 21st century America. Of course, in places like New Zealand with Prime Minister, she's out there, Jacinda, she's out there saying, we get to take away people's rights if they don't take the toxic sludge. And you have these kind of giddy things going on in places like Canada, just pure Nazism, pure fascism. And in Australia, we've seen maybe the worst of it. So we're in a strange situation as that is creeping around the globe, and certainly in the UK and here in America. In America, I think that we are really looking at something dramatic, because America has that reputation for freedom, and we're going to get into that because President Kennedy was all about free men and women making choices, whether it was the space program or the reduction of arms, and nuclear arms in particular, the future of the planet. It was about free men and women doing this. What we have now is the inverse going on. And you have some really loud voices against it, like Rand Paul, for example, representing you know, a clear, keen understanding of the Constitution. And then we have psychos like Fauci who, you know, just want to grab your kids, basically. So, and he's been up to his neck in all kinds of crime since I've been doing a lot of research on him. If you go back even to the Village Voice did an article in 1987 about misappropriation of funds for AIDS research, and Fauci was in charge of that. This is somebody who's been a thorn in America's side for a long time and needs to be exposed and brought down. And it is starting to happen, interestingly enough. Many of you may have heard out there this remarkable story of, you know, one of the experiments that he had going on. And it's so horrible, I can't even think about it. But you know, was to have all these fleas eat the heads of these puppies. I kid you not. It's not a horror movie. It's Dr. Mengele Fauci. So this stuff is coming out, and, you know, I see a lot of you know that, yes, it was the torture of dogs. And, you know, he's someone who is a key player. You know, Fitz calls him a desk killer, and I think that that's a really good description. So we find ourselves surrounded by these types, and the overreach is on. But there's something else, which is the big pushback, and it's underneath, and you can feel it building. And the clash of those two forces feels very much like the kinds of things we've seen in history. The pushback against the advance of Nazism, you know, the pushback against the really tyrannical Soviet regime. There's just something inherent in people that, especially in America and around the world, who want to see the world progress in a free fashion. And so all these things that they've been pushing, from the lockdowns to the vaccine passports and all this nonsense, this is really so related to our subject matter tonight, because it's really a free world versus a slave world. And President Kennedy is an excellent example for us to take in this regard. I'm going to read some special quotes from him tonight as well. I'm going to go into, again, their official explanation. Biden delays the release of the JFK assassination records. He was supposed to release them on Tuesday, now the 26th, mandated by law to do so, disobeying the law. Decades of secrecy end as Trump allows release of last JFK assassination records. This was supposed to happen. It was supposed to be all the records on October 26th, 2017. It didn't happen, but I'll tell you, Trump got some good ones out. I'll give him credit. But unfortunately, the Garrison files, which are the key files, and the files related to a mysterious figure named George Ioannidis, who was the head of the psychological unit inside the CIA, psychological warfare unit. He's the one who set up the Oswald op. And so he wasn't even on the record. No one even knew who he was until the last 10 or 15 years or so. And so the CIA clings for dear life, trying to keep this guy's past a complete mystery. So what we're going to find out is that he invented the psychological operation that was Oswald. This is one from today. This is CBS. White House delays the release of JFK assassination files to protect against identifiable harm. The only people it's going to harm at this point is the Central Intelligence Agency. So that's the identifiable harm. So I've just identified it for them, because you know, you don't have agents in the field who are operatives 60 years later. It's a fallacy, you know. And as I said, those situations, even those countries, are gone. The only thing they're trying to protect is the fact that the Central Intelligence Agency and other agencies in the government participated in the assassination of President Kennedy and then covered it up with the help of the media. That's the big secret. And it's not so secret because even the public, in the latest poll, 68% of them don't believe the official version. So, you know, that psychological warfare operation didn't work, no matter how many times they repeat it. And that, I think, shows that there's hope in the minds and hearts of everyone. I want to talk a little bit about Oswald. You know, his birthday just passed, and we forget that Oswald was 24 years old when he was accused of this crime, and when he was killed a couple of days later by Jack Ruby. And we have some very strange things on Ruby, who was a gun runner and a mafia figure. But what's crucial, I think, is that he was under psychological counseling once they grabbed him. And the psychological counseling was by an individual associated with the MK Ultra program. That's when Ruby starts to come apart. And he's going to be kind of important in all this as well. The Warren Commission left all of those leads off the table, and they were like, "Oh yeah, he owned a strip club." That's the way they left it. They didn't go into any of his years in Cuba or drug running, guns running, work with organized crime. None of that. In fact, what's interesting is if you go back to 1949, you're going to find Jack Ruby in Chicago as an informant, giving information to Richard Nixon's committee investigating drug running. So Ruby, is very familiar inside of these circles. So when he comes out as, the assassin of Oswald and all that, there's no media about him being associated with as a government informant, which he was 14 years earlier. So you can't miss those connections. It's absurd. But let's talk about Oswald for a minute. As I said, I did a documentary on Oswald because he's a fascinating figure. But he's also the intermix in all of this, because one of the key things we have to know about Oswald is that the thing that he did the longest in his life, there's no job or family responsibility that was longer than his time in the military, which lasts for 5 years, and maybe beyond if you consider his excursion to the Soviet Union as just an undercover military intelligence operation, which it clearly was. So we have to remember that Oswald is a Marine. He goes into the Civil Air Patrol at 15. So, this is somebody who from an early age, imagine yourself at 15 in a military institution, and then at 17 joining the Marines and being in there. So that in total, if you look at it, from the age of 15 to the age of 22, there he is in the military that whole time. Then supposedly he gets a hardship discharge and defects to the Soviet Union. So we have to remember him more than the way they portray him as, this lone psycho or whatever. He's a military guy. He's born and bred in the military. He basically had nothing else in life. There were times in his life that are very unexplained, all the way back to living in New York, which doesn't get talked about very much at all. How about when he lived simultaneously in New Orleans and in New York and went to school in both places? How does that work? He spent time in an orphanage and was raised by a single mom. So he was kind of a very interesting target for these intelligence groups. And one of the main people who created Oswald for the intelligence people was someone named David Ferry. And Ferry worked both for the mafia and for the CIA as a pilot, drug running and all the rest. He came out in the Jim Garrison investigation. Now, one thing I want to say here, which is that the Warren Commission and the media and all these authors, they would always say Ferry had nothing to do with Oswald, and they would just freak out about it. And then eventually a photo was found of them both together in the Civil Air Patrol, and that was the end of that. But you didn't hear them come out and say, "Oh, I apologize, I was wrong, and my information was stupid," or, there was none of that. It was just, hey, it came up and they stopped talking about it because they were wrong. This is the kind of thing that happens, and it's also the same type of thing that we see happening with all of the nonsense around the COVID thing as well, which is they come out, they say something, a couple months later, it's proved clearly wrong. They just go along. There's no acknowledgement of it. That's how you know you're in just a kind of psychotic narrative. It's just a narrative that has to win no matter what. So they're not going to acknowledge anything, and they're just going to spin everything their way. So a number of those people who came out, like Gerald Posner with the Case Closed book and all that, he just never acknowledged that he was totally wrong in saying that Ferry didn't know Oswald. In fact, Ferry was not only an intelligence contact, but one of his key specialties was psychological operations and hypnosis. This figure that I mentioned, who became, the person who analyzed Jack Ruby after he shoots Oswald, is also someone who's an expert at hypnosis and psychological, MK Ultra control. So we're looking at a piece there that was coming out of the deep state and on to the public. And so the public really didn't know what was going on. This is the piece. Now, when I look at it, I think to myself, there's a lot of different aspects that were happening in that period of time. If you look at 1962, The Manchurian Candidate came out. And in this movie, they understand MK Ultra completely well. They understand this aspect. But the general public, they delayed that film once the JFK assassination happened. But the general public was just starting to get on board with this. Like, they didn't really know about mind control. So you can see how this whole thing happened and how it wound down. I found it particularly disturbing that when you get into things like the Manson killings, etc., you find the same cast of MK Ultra doctors and controllers coming forward, and it just turns out that they were associated with Manson. This shows that they've been social engineering at such a level for such a long time that we have to look at things differently. When we're looking at history, we have to see it as a series of narratives. And most of the stuff that they've fed us in regard to this, from the JFK assassination to Manson to the RFK assassination to 9/11 and the other deep events, as Professor Scott would say, we're getting a narrative. We're getting their picture of how they want social development, social engineering to happen. So as I mentioned, a key thing about Oswald is that he worked for someone named Guy Bannister. And Bannister is a very key figure because he's not only kind of rabid anti-communist, who was a former head of the Chicago office of the FBI, but he also, in the late 40s, was the head of the kind of weird desk at the FBI, and he was the one who went out and researched all the flying saucer UFO cases. So when we're looking at Bannister, we're seeing an entree into a whole exotic technology world. And we have to remember with Bannister that he is someone who not only is investigating these cases, he comes up with the X designation for the UFO file at FBI. So when we get into this program and we talk about X steganography and how crucial that is for hiding programs through different government agencies, we have to really say that Bannister is one of the key people who does it. He takes Oswald in as an operative to infiltrate student groups and portray himself as a big Cuban supporter, Fidel Castro supporter, handing out leaflets. And what happens is that it's discovered by Garrison that Oswald is operating in the same office as Bannister. By the way, Garrison, who is the DA that I mentioned earlier of New Orleans, who pressed the only trial in the history, he put the only person on trial for the murder of John Kennedy in history, he knew Bannister because he briefly was in the FBI himself. And so in those days, the very early days, the main beat of Bannister would have been this UFO file thing. There's actually newspaper stories and clippings, if you go through that era, of him investigating these cases and talking to witnesses about the UFO sighting. But that's the era, that's the time period when Garrison would have known him. So we have an early link in there with the X technology and with the UFO file around the JFK assassination immediately. And I think that's crucial. But nonetheless, even beyond that aspect, here's the deal. They always portray Oswald as this big left-winger. He wanted to defect to the Soviet Union, supposedly, and he was giving secrets away, and he wanted to be Fidel Castro's right-hand man and all this stuff. But Bannister is completely right-wing. And so the idea that he's working for him is pretty clear then that all the other stuff he's doing is part of his intelligence operation, and Bannister is one of those handlers. It's very clear because nothing else explains the fact that he's working in the same office and doing projects for. And this came out all through the 70s and 80s when all those people would come forward and say, well, Oswald was always in the office. This is where he did his stuff. He was running errands, and he was handing out leaflets, and he was infiltrating student groups. That whole piece is well documented. So we have to ask ourselves, really, when we look at the historical part, who was Oswald that they were using him to this point? He was somebody that they needed as the CIA patsy. And, he set up such a great cover story of being the Soviet defector that when he's grabbed for the JFK assassination, it's easy to portray him as guilty before any trial or anything else. And then you just shoot him a couple of days later using a mind-controlled mafia gunrunner. I mean, this is how it played out. The question is, where does it leave us 58 years later? How do we explain this? Right now in the history books, or if you were to answer a quiz in high school, and it gave you options that who assassinated President Kennedy. If you don't answer Lee Harvey Oswald, you're wrong. But that's just, a social construct. There's no evidence. That's one thing that I went into in the documentary. And I did the documentary a while ago now. So it's like 7 years ago. But it still all holds up. The thing I want to point out about it is all of the evidence that we know of in relation to Oswald, all the nonsense like the magic bullet and all that stuff, none of it would have stood up in a court of law because, first of all, the original police who were on the scene found a completely different rifle than Oswald's rifle. And one of them owned a sporting goods shop and was like, hey, that's a Mauser. And so Oswald's rifle was a Mannlicher Carcano. So the police who saw it, it was a Mauser. By the time they accuse Oswald, they transform the rifle. So it's a setup, but it represents a setup on a level from the CIA through the media down to the police department itself in Dallas. So it's a real major operation when we look at it. And this is why there's such a sensitivity around these records. And I think it's crucial when the records come out that, I'm speaking about it like they will. Here's an interesting thing. In fact, the figure that I mentioned previously, George Joannides, is someone who was discovered by a Washington Post reporter named Jefferson Morley. And the Washington Post didn't want him pursuing that, in fact, so he left. And he does his own research now. But Joannides wasn't even part of the original request for the records. So those records are in court in a separate case. They are actually very crucial records because they're going to show not only his awareness, Joannides' awareness and his psychological warfare activities of Oswald, it's going to show him setting up Oswald and the Oswald operation. So that is why those records are so crucial. And I'm going to get into Joannides just a little bit. This, of course, as we know, is how Oswald ended up. And the strange thing, and it's very strange, is that the funeral director said that the Secret Service came out there later and fingerprinted him and took his palm print. So suddenly, the original rifle that they had didn't have any fingerprints or palm prints. And then a week later, they discover it because they go out to the corpse and they put the corpse's hand on the rifle. But what's strange is the commentary that the agents give to the funeral director, and he's on the record years later saying this, is that the fingerprints that they find on this individual who's in the coffin don't match the fingerprint records that we have militarily of Lee Harvey Oswald. Also, Oswald's listed as 5'8" in the military records, but what happens is that this corpse is 5'11". So there's a lot of strangeness there, and it's led to people thinking there were two Oswalds. There's no question there were Oswald doubles. That's just, very clear. But the presence of this second person goes way back in his history. In fact, if you go to his years in junior high school, you will find two Lee Harvey Oswalds operating, one in New York and one in New Orleans. So Oswald is a construct, and he is also a legend. It's what they call it in intelligence terms. When you are setting up somebody, you have them appear in a certain place and people lock it in their heads. Oh, this guy said his name was Oswald, So they have these stories. Once it comes out and this guy is put on the spot, they'll be like, oh yeah, he's the guy who talked about communism. When in fact, it was somebody like Bannister setting him up and saying, go over here, infiltrate those student groups and pretend you're a communist. So they built this whole thing, and including putting him up for televised debates the summer before the assassination. So that's really close, and it gives us a snapshot of what they were trying to do. Of course, later they would say that he would visit the Mexican Cuba embassy in order to get a visa for Cuba, but then the pictures that they showed were a completely different individual. And then finally they said, oh, we have all this information that it was him, but we can't show you because the cameras failed. So all kinds of chicanery going on in relation to Oswald. But why? And why is he connected with Bannister? And why is he connected with NASA and Lockheed Martin? How does all the aerospace piece fit with Oswald? That's what I'm going to get at here. We're going to learn why, if the Garrison files come out, it's going to be a big problem for the Central Intelligence Agency. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is a really kind of timely special report on the Biden administration and the CIA blocking the release of the JFK assassination records, most of which are CIA records. We're going to be going deep into that, and we will be coming back, of course, later in the week with a full show. But I'm going to maybe do another 30 or 40 minutes on this. We have Carolyn Goida out there running the Ideas Room. And although we're not taking questions tonight, definitely have your questions ready for next week. Okay, I mentioned George Joannides. Here is Joannides, and he's in the middle. He was the super secretive operative. Very strange history on him, psychological warfare, and there he is getting a Lifetime Achievement Award. This guy is Bobby Inman, who was the deputy CIA director and also the head of the NSA at a certain point. Inman, in the late 80s, would talk about how the U.S. had UFO crash retrievals, and he would say that they were very aware of who the occupants were. I kid you not. That's on the record. There's so many strange things about Inman. Later, he would work at SAIC, and he's just such a major deep state player that when I see him handing out this award to Joannides, to see them both together, this kind of deep state operative with close ties to the UFO file, and actually going on the record saying, yeah, we have recovered craft, and we know who was operating them, suggesting it was aliens, or at least they knew who it was, right there with the psychological operations master who created the assassination scenario. That, I think, is a very telltale piece. Another telltale piece involves this person, and this is a pretty esoteric slice. So get your esoteric mind ready on this, because it's quite remarkable, and it ties in a way with an episode I just did with Gigi Young, which was remarkable, and it's just getting incredible feedback. But I really highly recommend that episode dealing with the 9 and the whole UFO file aspect, as only Gigi can do. But this is Michael Payne, and Michael Payne is a very interesting figure because he is the husband of Ruth Payne, and this couple will house the Oswalds when they come back from the Soviet Union. Of course, Oswald, he returns, and he has a Russian bride. One of the things I want to say about Payne is his connections right off the bat are quite remarkable. First of all, he's working at Bell Helicopter, and his immediate superior and mentor is Walter Dornberger, who has become a vice president there at Bell Helicopter. I find this interesting for a lot of reasons, because, of course, Dornberger is a Nazi. And there he is with his good friend, Werner von Braun. That's in their Nazi days. So there's the American space program, but snapshot 1943. It was a Nazi space program then. And it's before we got these guys. But Dornberger will be one of those Nazis who is saved from execution at Nuremberg, because von Braun says, I can't do the rocket program without him. I need him. And so the Americans do, in fact, release him, and he gets into the country. What's interesting is when he's held in prison temporarily, they say, well, this guy's not contrite at all. He can never be made into a good citizen. He's still preaching Nazism, and he's, this is not somebody that we can recuperate from his Nazi beliefs. So Dornberger is the master of that rocket program, and he is a general, and he's also von Braun's immediate superior. And he used slave labor along with von Braun to build the V-2 rockets, which they used to bomb the UK with. But this same Dornberger comes to America, and they set him up as the VP of Bell Helicopter. Then this Payne character shows up and says, hey, I need a job. And suddenly Dornberger takes an interest in him, and he's working there in that milieu of this ex-Nazi rocket program. By the way, he's the father of the X series of space planes, including the X-15, which still holds the speed record for a manned space plane. And that was done in like 1961. So think about that. So when we look at Dornberger, we have to ask ourselves, what is the connection there? What are we looking at? And Dornberger is connected with this aspect at NASA, which is the former Nazis coming in there and controlling that. At a certain point, there's a Blue Gemini program, and Kennedy sends in his top defense man, Robert McNamara, and he says, go to these people at NASA who are the scientists, etc., and tell them we will literally turn that NASA program over to the military, which would be unprecedented, if they don't stop, because there's two programs going on. There's the public space program, and there's this thing that they're doing. So there's the first acknowledgement in a document. It came out in 2015. It was declassified, of the secret space program, in fact. So Kennedy's seeing it, and he's saying, what's going on? Because we have a space program. What's this other thing? And so Blue Gemini seems to be sort of the apex of where that happens. And I want to say the program after Blue Gemini is called Dynasoar, Dynasoar. That program is one of the only listed titles left from anything that Guy Bannister, who we showed you earlier, had ever done, because all of his work was trashed by the FBI, and all of his stuff was disappeared. But his wife had sold a few things to the local library there, and strangely enough, they still exist. And they're just heading titles for the different things that he had. One of them has the JFK assassination. Right under it, and I've shown this list before, is the Dynasoar space warcraft. So Bannister's working around the space program and warcraft. No one ever called Dynasoar warcraft. So what was it that he knew in relation to it? So the aerospace aspects around Oswald and around the JFK assassination, and then these former Nazis infiltrating the space program and housing Oswald when he comes back from the Soviet Union, are very strange. They're just very strange pieces, because, again, Oswald supposedly is just a nobody who's going to work for $1.25 at a book depository. Why are these people taking such an interest? Why are they having him stay in their home, etc.? And their technical answers are quite absurd. It's like, oh, well, he came from Russia, so we're interested in learning Russian, so we want to talk with him. There's lots of other people in Dallas to practice Russian with in that period, beside the alleged assassin of the president. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is a special report we're doing for you on the non-release, the block of the CIA block of the release of JFK records, and President Biden coming out with this ridiculous statement. Stepford Biden, who seems to be freezing up a lot in public, and I think that the Stepford aspect is going to be harder and harder to hide. I've heard all kinds of stories of the types of drugs that they've used to keep his brain going. And one in particular that was developed over at MIT. What I've learned, and that drug, the original name for, I don't know what they ended up calling it, was called Storm, and they had done research on this thing for Alzheimer's patients. But in Biden's case, they've used it to keep him somewhat coherent. But as we can see, like in the Anderson Cooper piece, this guy's not really making it. There's big problems there, and it's not just about him forgetting dates. He just seems to be in a different world completely. And trust me, the other nations of the world are looking at that, and they know what's going on. So we need to talk about it because they for sure are talking about it. This is also one of the worst administrations I think we've ever seen in the history, at least as long as I've been alive. I try to go back and look at some of those earlier administrations, but I can tell you that, the Reagan administration, the Bush administration, like there were functional aspects. They still could keep their guy out there doing press conferences and things like that. This guy just needs scripted events. He wobbles off, he goes off script. He is, he's a disaster in relation to Afghanistan. It's the worst foreign policy incident that we've had. It goes right back to the withdrawal from Vietnam in 1975, just a disaster. And plus, he left hundreds of billions of dollars of sophisticated equipment in their hands, which is absurd, especially after Trump said, we laid out a policy, which is leave the munitions behind. Don't touch our planes and the stuff that's there that we set up for the Afghan military, because if you do, we'll bomb it. Well, he just let them have it. So there's some reason that Biden is equipping the Taliban with some of the most sophisticated, killing machines on the planet. So we have to wonder what's really going on there with the drug piece. But this entire administration, with the inflation, with the real vaccine mandates, just a complete disaster. So we're watching one of the worst campaigns in history from 2020, where they just hung around and drive-in movies and stood on crates and stuff and supposedly won. Just doesn't add up, frankly. So whatever someone thought of Trump or whatever, the key piece, I believe, is that Trump stood up to China, and that is it's the ultimate no-no in this environment, because the Davos crowd, the Klaus Schwab World Economic Forum people, have been building China for 3 decades to be their headquarters for the new America. They want it to be their global governance, and they want this constitutionally run America to become the homeland where, we get roving agents defending the homeland, and there's no constitution, and do what you're told or else. So I think that the real piece that we need to zone in on when we're looking at the geopolitics is that Trump, for whether you like him or don't like him, was a real staunch pushback against China. And Biden, as we know from his son's artwork and those connections, but just Biden in general, locked in with the Davos crowd and with China and the CCP, making tremendous inroads in our own government. Just look at the governor of California, for example. So it's going to, that's going to a pretty heavy duty place, and the unmasking is going to be pretty dramatic. So I think we're looking at a lot of that now. And I think all of the battles that we're seeing in relation to the biofascism piece are also coming to the fore. And we're going to see that, the Biden administration is not only criminal, as they've demonstrated with blocking these records, but they're complicit with a foreign power. So we're going to have to, it's going to be a bumpy ride, I would say, over the next couple of years for sure. I mentioned Michael Payne, if we go back there for a moment, and how he and his wife housed Lee Harvey Oswald and his wife. And Marina's a very, very interesting case because, they sort of brainwashed her and bullied her into saying Lee did all these things. But then in the 80s and 90s, she came out as a very big Lee Harvey Oswald supporter, saying that he wasn't guilty and that she had been kind of coached. And in some cases, because her English wasn't so good, they just kind of put words in her mouth, and that was that. This is Arthur Young. He is Michael Payne's stepfather. I want to point him out because he's the one who made the helicopter that he sold to Bell Helicopter. He is the original inventor, in fact. Now, here's what's so interesting about Arthur Young. First of all, his connection immediately with Michael Payne. Second, his connection with Bell Helicopter, which Dornberger, remember Dornberger the Nazi, right there, he becomes the head of Bell Helicopter. And his mentor, or his protege, I should say, is Michael Payne. Okay. But Young is very interesting because what does he do in the future? He develops a consciousness studies institute. And he's a very deep character. His wife, Ruth Forbes, is a major part of a group called the Nine, who are a channeling group that get together. It's a bunch of wealthy people, along with some Indian gurus and occultists, and they're contacting this outer space group called the Nine. And this goes on for years. And I illustrated a lot of this in the episode with Gigi Young that we just did, so you can get more of the details there. And Uri Geller gets involved and all the rest. But what's interesting to me is that Young is so into consciousness and so into mysticism. He marries Forbes. She has all this channeling going on with the Nine. And then it's her son and his stepson who's going to be housing Lee Harvey Oswald. So whenever you get around the JFK assassination, you've got a geopolitical aspect, certainly, but you've got a key UFO, X technology, and then mysticism piece. And it's undeniable just in the connections that we laid out right there. There's instantly, because they think they're communicating with ETs, and that's Payne's mother, So this is a part that's not really reported on enough, and it's not really explored enough. But I think it's quite crucial when we look at the mysticism piece and when we look at the presence of people like Arthur Young, who became such leaders in consciousness work, that we have to take on the aspect that this deep state that's operating and committing these types of crimes and the deep events that change history from JFK through Watergate and 9/11, through the COVID thing and the financial coup d'etat 2008, the whole thing, the same group, they're deeply steeped in mysticism, and their key secret is what's in the UFO file. So we have to kind of remember that. It's going to give us a better sort of understanding of who they are, so we can look through them to see what is it that they're dealing with, as opposed to just thinking, oh, they were anti-communists and they thought Kennedy was soft on communism and they got rid of him. It doesn't work, because there were a lot of different ways for them to take the Kennedy administration down. They had a big problem with Kennedy. Kennedy knew a lot. And this is the thing, and it's not well understood, that Kennedy had been a congressman since 1946. So he's in office 14 years. 6 years as a congressman, 8 years as a senator. He's very well versed in foreign policy, and all the things that are going on. There are all these stories about him during that presidential year, and one of them is told by Fletcher Prouty. And Fletcher Prouty would be somebody who gives us a real keen insight because he was the liaison between the CIA and the Pentagon and the Joint Chiefs. And he came out after the JFK assassination and just said, this was a setup, and people inside the military-industrial complex and the CIA took part in it, which is a big deal for someone on that level to come out and say. But, this is somebody who had a fantastic military track record and always had tremendous sources. One of the quotes that he has, which I don't see brought out very much, I don't understand how this gets missed because we're so big on quotes in the alternative field. Here's his quote from his own book. You ready? It will be interesting to see what enemy develops in the years ahead. It appears that UFOs and aliens are being primed to fulfill that role for the future. That's Prouty in 1997. I'm going to read it again. It will be interesting to see what enemy develops in the years ahead. It appears that UFOs and aliens are being primed to fill that role for the future. That's somebody who knew the deep state aspect very well, understood the assassination capability, executive action that had taken place in relation to the Kennedy assassination, and he's warning us that they're going to use UFOs and aliens to create kind of this false flag environment, the UFO threat. So often throughout this year, as they've had the UAP reports and all this stuff coming out, they've been pushing what? The UFO threat. What was the group that originally pushed it? The TTSA. Who was behind the TTSA? The TTSA had over 100 years of cumulative CIA experience. They had the top people from the CIA as part of that group. So when they came out with these stories and they were doing, hey, here's the New York Times disclosure story, and we've got Lou Elizondo, and he's a disgruntled person from this government agency, and he wants to give us the truth. If you dig even a half-inch deep, you're going to find a 25-year history for Elizondo with the intelligence agencies. So what's really going on there is the things that these people knew on the inside that they were going to use against us at some point. They didn't know when, which is why sometimes they would look pretty far out, because it would be like 20 years after they said it, and people would look around and say, well, that never happened. But then it happens. And, during most of the lockdown period in 2020, what were we seeing? They were rolling out UFO story after UFO story. Even the stories from 2017, it was the same tic-tac footage. And look at this. And then they had, Corbell and all that nonsense that they were leaking stuff to him. And then these websites were getting set up overnight and then being quoted by CBS News. It's like, who's doing all this stuff? So we have to kind of see that they're going to be using the UFO piece, the alien part, as part of the control system. So I've been fond of saying, if you thought the COVID op was something, just wait till you get to the alien UFO threat op. And we're right in the heart of it. They tried to push it heavy, and then they fell flat on it in the summer. They're going to come back with it, and they tried to elect Elizondo as the main man for this thing. And Elizondo, as I said, is a very, this is somebody who does a lot of dancing in public. And what I mean by that is he says, oh, I was in a classified program, but it wasn't classified. And this is the kind of intelligence game these people like to play, but they keep pushing him out there as an expert, Fox News, CNN, this guy's all over the place. But he's part of this operation to create a UFO threat. And they felt initially that this would be the thing that they could sell to the government and then, get into the whole alien part, etc. So that's out there. It's something that we really need to be aware of. And it's something that, oddly enough, has its genesis in the Kennedy period. Now, this is, again, where I think we need to put the deep state research mind on as opposed to the UFO investigation mind on. Here's the thing. The deep state, the people who investigate things like, plane crashes where they kill politicians or the Kennedy assassinations, they understand very well how the government works in regard to that. The UFO investigators don't. They have a problem. They're basically they're looking so badly to fulfill their "I was right, there are aliens" thing that they'll go along with anybody, anywhere, anytime. And they'll play along with anything as long as they get some kind of credential out of it. If they can get credit or a TV show or something that shows that they were right, then forget it. They'll sit on the CIA's lap to do it. So the deep state researchers have a kind of academic ethic in relation to the research that they do about the government and exposing it. And this is, people like Peter Dale Scott, for example, they have a core ethic that goes into this. Not that Scott would ever get into the UFO field. What I'm trying to suggest is that in the UFO field, we need the deep state research, because if you don't have it, if you don't have that kind of understanding, you're not going to get any real facts. There's no disclosure. If they won't even give you Kennedy's CIA records from 58 years ago, how are you going to get a CIA disclosure on the UFO file? It's never going to happen. They're going to give you a narrative and a story. So we have to kind of be educated ourselves in relation to this and not fall for any of that stuff, especially if it's coming through the media, which blocked this subject, if anything, for 70 years, and kept it completely, a subject of ridicule. But let's go deeper than that. The CIA unit that protects the whole thing, who were they? This is the group I've called X-Protect. They sometimes, they'll protect it by discrediting it. But sometimes those people just disappear, and so if you go all the way back to Morris Jessup in the late 50s, that's somebody getting too close to the operation, and he shows up suddenly, in a park with carbon monoxide hose through his car. So we have to be aware of that group and how it's operated through history. That's going to give us, much better insight to political assassination, and it has to be front and center when we deal with the JFK assassination. I know there are JFK assassination researchers out there, I think, who would be very happy to just kind of go forward and say, were there anti-Castro Cubans involved? Or, just the Texas oil men, maybe they had something to do with it. But you have to look at the key thing, the flashpoint is the aerospace piece. And that's where the advancement was. That's where the control of the globe was going. Kennedy didn't want a space race. He wanted to replace that with a joint manned mission to the moon. That's something that came out from Khrushchev's son. And it's in records, it's absolutely documented. So it would have been a totally different approach on all of these things. So the deep state group that was creating the reality, they couldn't have somebody like Kennedy interfering with their plan by being someone who wanted to invite humanity to be free. They regarded his cooperation with the Soviet Union on the moon program, and with Russia, they regard that as a national security threat on their side, because the thing that they were doing had to do with development of secret technology, and they didn't want to share that with anybody. That was the X technology, not necessarily just the UFO technology, X technology. And we could be talking there about the Tesla work, the Keeley work. They were tapping into these energies. They were tapping into this extra technology. So that's, I think, is a crucial piece. So speaking of how we need to get our head wrapped around the Kennedy part on the UFO side, of course, I've interviewed Douglas Caddy, who was the lawyer for the Watergate 7. He's the first lawyer for the Watergate 7. And that's him there. And of course, we know Woodward and Bernstein there, who broke the Deep Throat story and the huge Watergate story. This person is, has that historical standing, having gone through these things. Douglas Caddy, went on the record saying that his good friend, who was E. Howard Hunt, who was the CIA spy master involved in all kinds of assassination plans, told him in private that Kennedy was assassinated over the UFO file. That's a kind of a key snapshot if you want to understand this whole piece. The UFO field missed it on their side because they were too busy running around after Lou Elizondo. The deep state researchers aren't interested in the UFO piece. So what happens to that crucial historical piece that's put on the record by a historical figure who was involved with Watergate and who knew the top CIA person? So this is how, we need a different understanding, I think, when it comes to these fields. This is what dark journalism is about. It's bringing this type of information out. This is what we're doing on this program. And you see it happening through the work of Joseph Farrell. He integrates these pieces unapologetically. And Catherine Austin Fitts, these are the places where it happens. And with the work we do on this program, Gigi Young, of course, as well. But the X series, this is a crucial piece. This is how we can come to understand these incidents on a totally different level, and also see, when the black op is happening, how to unravel it in a short period of time, because we're currently under some of the biggest global control in history. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We've got a special report here for you on the CIA and the Biden administration, Stepford Biden, blocking access to the CIA JFK assassination records. They just announced that. And we're going to do maybe about another half hour with you on this. And we're coming back later in this week. We have some great interviews coming up for you as well. We just did one with Gigi Young on the UFO file and Mars and more. And we're going to have some great people like Dr. Joseph Farrell and Catherine Fitts coming up in just a very short period of time. Okay. So these relationships, I want to point out one other thing in relation to Kennedy. And so we understand what an iconoclast and a maverick that he was in relation to this. When he gets into office, he recognizes that the CIA is doing all sorts of things that aren't sanctioned by the president or even the Joint Chiefs. So his first kind of order of business, first of all, it's shock that overtakes him. But by the time they roll into this Bay of Pigs operation in Cuba and try to force him into a full-scale war with Cuba, his response is to fire Allen Dulles. But Dulles has been in there and he set up the CIA. So even when he's fired, he maintains this presence. And when Kennedy is assassinated, they put Dulles on the commission. In fact, many people call the Warren Commission the Dulles Commission because he's the guy who's running all the intelligence leads, and that's the only thing that really matters. So Kennedy's own ethic is to take these sacred cows like Dulles and to fire them and to have a new paradigm there in relation to the CIA. What he tries to do is create something called NSAM 57. It's a National Security Action Memorandum. Here's why this is so crucial, I think, for us to understand. This memorandum limits the CIA's ability to do clandestine operations, and it hands that authority over to the Joint Chiefs, back to the military, which is where it was supposed to be in the first place. So National Security Action Memorandum, which is available at the Kennedy Library, 55, 56, and 57. They're just sitting there, and it says the CIA has to report up to the Joint Chiefs, and they can't go and do these operations on their own. He gives that to the Joint Chiefs, and they don't know what to do with it because they don't want a full-scale war with the CIA on their hands. It never gets implemented during the Kennedy years, and it hangs out there. At the end of the Trump administration, his acting defense minister, Christopher Miller, activates, along with Ezra Cohen, the National Security Action Memorandum 57, which puts the CIA back into a supportive role. And it says that by January 7th, that all that funding and everything else gets taken away. What they've done with it since is very mysterious because the CIA seems to be operating in the same old fashion. But from my way of looking at it, it's an extreme shot across the bow from the Trump administration after the event of the election. He fires the defense secretary, Mark Esper, which is also an unusual thing to do, to fire somebody after the election is over and you're supposedly a lame duck on your way out. So there were all sorts of unusual moves that Trump was making after the election. One of the key things that he did was activate this National Security Action Memorandum, which was just hanging out there from the Kennedy years. Whenever we get around Trump, we get around this deep understanding of what's going on the deep state side, and we also get into advanced technology. Remember, Trump was talking about how we had planes that had invisibility, and they tried to get him to shut up. This is a crucial piece. Trump comes out of an advanced family on this piece because of John Trump, his uncle, who was a nuclear scientist. But he was far more than that, because he was the protege of Vannevar Bush. And we did an episode called Tesla, Trump, and the Time Capsule, which is actually the most popular X Series episode. And that piece is a crucial thing for us to understand, because you don't understand the opposition to Trump, and we don't understand, for example, his moves to get the UFO file back by creating the Space Force, unless you understand the piece about his Uncle John. And it's well known, of course, that Uncle John was the one who got called in by the FBI to search through Tesla's records for death ray information as soon as he was dead. Now, he got called in on the advice of Vannevar Bush, because that's his protege. And he said, this is the guy who can do it. And the FBI, it's recorded, asked John Trump, we want information on the taking down of flying objects at a distance. For example, I'm in Hawaii, I press a button, and there's a plane, or there's an object going around in London, and I can take it down. This is what they were looking for, meaning that, remember, the FBI will be the ones who will come up with the term unidentified flying object and the X terminology for the X-Files through Guy Bannister. So they're asking him, basically, if there are objects flying around, how do we take them down at a distance? So that may be on the record, one of the first things that we learn about how they want to take UFOs down. You could say it was planes, but the fact that they mentioned that it's flying objects, I just think is interesting. John Trump is an interesting figure in this regard, because when we look at Trump's own background, he will cite him over and over again, which is odd. And one of the things we can say about John Trump is that on the record, his work dealt with space, because it was about a near and shortwave radiation into space and radar and all the rest of that. The programs that he was associated with, he was set off on that path by Vannevar Bush. And of course, Van Bush there with Truman. He worked with everyone from FDR, Truman, and Eisenhower. And I have a picture of him with Richard Nixon in 1972 as a very elderly man. What we know now on the record is that one of the top physicists in the country who worked on the UFO file in the 50s came out and said the person who controlled the UFO file was Vannevar Bush. And, he died shortly after and was sort of erased from history. But what's interesting is Vannevar Bush then will show up in all kinds of, MJ-12 documents and things like that. But it seems to be just understood that Bush, even beyond any mysterious documents, on the record, is somebody who was controlling for a decade the UFO file. And even the succession of who controlled the UFO file after that was put on the record in that period. And it is in that Tesla, Trump, and the Time Capsule video. So I'll spare you the details now. James Forstall also here, I think this is crucial for us to understand his deep relationship with JFK. They were both Catholics. He took a young reporter, JFK, to survey the ruins of Berlin after it had been destroyed. He was very close with the Kennedy family, and Kennedy, of course, famously took the time off during a campaign event to go visit his grave, and there are pictures from that event. So interesting little side note is that he ran Dylan Reed and company, and that's where Fitz would show up later and become a partner in that institution. But I think that there's something about Forrestal. What came out in later anecdotes and records was that he wanted to share the UFO file, and this was his piece, that he thought this isn't something that they could keep as a secret. And of course, we know his very untimely death, thrown out a window at Bethesda Hospital. Well, they got rid of him, but think about his position. He was the first defense secretary. So that, talk about setting a tone. Here's the first defense secretary, and he is going to be, the person who balances out this whole UFO issue. He comes down on the side of saying, we need to share this information. We can't keep it boxed up. Humanity deserves it. And then he's thrown out a window. We have to think about that in relation to Kennedy as well, because Kennedy has a deep knowledge of the UFO track himself when he gets in. And then we also know that Eisenhower was on a deep track on the UFO file. So these things in the battle over this secrecy and its relation to space, again, you can control so much from space, whether it's low Earth orbit with satellites, driverless cars, all our communications come from that low Earth orbit. Well, when you get beyond that to the space fence, you're talking about global control here and then beyond, into the whole system. So they were looking at that, and they didn't want it. Kennedy's vision is bringing forward the freedom of free men and women to participate in this experiment. Instead, we have these weird billionaires and the military-industrial complex collaborating and owning space, and we're supposed to be locked down in our house, begging them for treats. And so an Amazon truck might go by and drop us a bag of food. That's the vision that they have. So we're in a kind of a sick, upside-down situation. We have to remember where the space program comes from and the idealism that set it forth. And the more we connect to that and remember who we are as a nation, the better off we're going to be. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep on the CIA block, along with Stepford Biden of the JFK assassination records. And we'll do about 20 more minutes. I got a few more things to share with you, including the fact that Kennedy, he understood these military and CIA types and tried to find a way to have Robert McNamara, the defense secretary, tell them, look, there's a new sheriff in town on this stuff. I know about the UFO file, and I'm committed to no war in space, and I'm not going to go up there and shoot with the Russians. We're going to do this differently. So this is also a big problem, because these people just want to dominate. And McNamara, who was here with Kennedy, Kennedy tells McNamara to go to this NASA group that's growing, the von Braun piece of that group, who is developing Blue Gemini. And he says to them, if you don't stop doing this, creating this secondary space program, I'm going to turn all of those things to the military. So I'll take the whole NASA piece is going to go to the military, even though, NASA is a non-military thing. I think what he's thinking there is, the military is the devil I know. This weird CIA quasi-aerospace piece mixed in with the former Nazis that are starting to go up, into space, and they're creating their own framework. This is, I think, the crucial part of the secret space program aspect. And he saw how dangerous it was, because we were also in a hair trigger for nuclear war with the Russians, who would look at anything that we were doing. One of the things that came out was a memo that Kennedy gave to the director of the Central Intelligence Agency saying, look, I want to share these kind of high impact cases with our Russian counterparts, so they don't mistake a UFO going over their nuclear bases as an American attack. So if we can share that information, this is maybe a place for us to cooperate. And then there is the charter and the executive memo for space cooperation, which you can read there at the Kennedy Library. It's not anybody's theory. It's sitting there where he's saying, look, we're going to collaborate with the Soviet Union, and we're going to do a joint mission into space. And this is how I want you to get ready for it. And he's telling the director of NASA how to do this. So it's a very different vision. And Kennedy, whether it was for civil rights or whether it was just that general understanding of the leadership and the responsibility that it has. He had been through World War II. They talk about Kennedy being rich and a pampered playboy and all that. But this is somebody who put himself on the line over and over again, even though he was from these privileged circumstances. And he was incredibly well educated, but he sort of self-educated in a number of ways as well. And we also had seen that his father had a great understanding of politics, but he also understood that his father's way of doing things was kind of like the backdoor way, and that he didn't hold the ethic, really, that Kennedy and his younger brother Robert had. So when the deep state encounters Kennedy, it's interesting. One of the first things the CIA does when he announces he's going to run for president is a psychological evaluation on him. And I think that they say to themselves, the only advantage that we have is this guy's young. Maybe we can pull the wool over his eyes. But they're worried because here's somebody who's coming in and he doesn't have any kind of financial dependency. That's number one, unlike Nixon and these other guys who are easy to manipulate. Howard Hughes is giving millions of dollars to Nixon for his brother's fast food chain. I mean, it's a totally different type of relationship. And of course, Nixon will reciprocate by giving Hughes the ability to call his space program a medical charity. So there's a lot of pieces there that are different. When you're talking about JFK, he's coming in, he's got his own connections, he's got his own money, he's got his own vision, and he's been in this world now for 15 years. So they're worried. They're thinking to themselves, we're not going to be able to control this guy. And in fact, when he gets into office, one of the first things he starts to sound out about is, I need to rein the CIA back in. By the time he's in his second year of office, he's quoted in the New York Times by one of his aides as saying, I'm going to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. Think about the threat that's going on there for him to be saying that. He knows that they're after him, and they know that he's going to ruin the game. That's even without considering the strange kind of post-Nazi influences that Dr. Farrell talks about. So we have to understand the Kennedy presidency totally differently. We have to understand the role of people like Oswald and get beyond the dumb caricatures that we see whenever these news programs come out and they're like, oh, Oswald was a disgruntled loner, I mean, this guy, there's a memo from 1960 of J. Edgar Hoover writing about this guy and saying someone's using his identity. He's aware of Oswald when Oswald's 21. And the director of the FBI is writing a memo about this guy. I mean, think about that. And also saying someone's using his identity. What's going on with that? Let's not also forget the figure who stood to gain the most from the CIA action against President Kennedy. Johnson, we have to be aware of this. Johnson was under indictment. Let's think about this. Johnson, his top aide, Billy Celestes, was grabbed and put into prison for creating a thing like false cotton allotments. And when the government, and the agriculture people got to look at these cotton allotments, they'd find, where there was supposed to be all this stuff, there was nothing. He was just funneling the money. And that was a program that he was doing. And then Johnson's second lieutenant, a guy named Bobby Baker, he also was getting into tremendous problems for taxes and call girl rings and all this stuff. And it was all tracking back to Johnson. And so Johnson, when they're going down there to Texas, he is at risk of getting thrown off the ticket, and then he's at risk of being thrown in prison. This has to be understood for his motivations and the level of his participation. Basically, Bobby Kennedy wants to get him off the ticket. It's documented. John Kennedy has said that he's going to take the North Carolina governor and run with him in 64. And then that they don't want to deal with Johnson anymore because he's too corrupt, he's too much baggage. And then on top of that, Nixon, who had lost to Kennedy in 1960, he's in Dallas. In fact, strangely enough, there are actually 5 current and future presidents and past presidents there in Dallas during the assassination. Ford was there, as we know. Bush was there. Nixon was there. Of course, Kennedy was there, and LBJ. Well, you have 5 presidents in one location in this very short 24-hour period. That's a little odd. But what's interesting about it is that Nixon is doing a press conference the night before the assassination, and he says Johnson's going to be off that ticket because he's a drag on the ticket, and you know they're going to choose somebody else for VP. It was that in the air that Johnson was going to prison. 2 of his main lieutenants were already in prison, and it was thought maybe they're going to spill about this guy. So if he doesn't assume to the presidency, he's going to be locked up in a federal prison. That gives us a much better understanding of Johnson. And of course, Johnson had a tremendously dark past. But here's another weird thing about Johnson is his nickname in the Senate was Senator NASA. His best friend was Werner von Braun. He gets the NASA Center in Texas. So he's a major space player. And, you know, very often when we hear about Johnson, it's like, well, he got the Fair Housing Act passed and all this stuff. You know, there's always a kind of a superficial glaze over these things. You go even a half-inch deep, you're going to find a totally different government operating. And I want to get into what that government is to give us a little snapshot, and then we're going to wrap up. We'll wrap up here at 10 o'clock Eastern. It's great having everyone with us. What a huge crowd for the special report. Of course, I'll be back with Miss Olivia next week, and we'll be taking your questions. Very happy to have Carolyn Goida, Kat Goida, out there running the show. And let's see, a couple of interesting shots just of Kennedy I collected to show you. We have to remember the impact of President Kennedy and how, you know, we really haven't had anybody independent. I mean, you could say that Trump had a certain level of independence. So I think that he ruffled the establishment the way that Kennedy did. But I think Kennedy's idealism, you know, is something that the deep state just felt themselves threatened by and needed to get rid of. Of course, the sequence of the assassination has been gone over many times. It's the CIA presence, and I'm going to read you a letter now of something that came out on the 50th anniversary of the JFK assassination. So there was a person who headed up an anti-Castro group named Antonio Veciana, and the CIA kept trying to get his group in there to assassinate Castro. And the person that was in charge of that operation was David Atlee Phillips, who was in charge of all covert operations for the CIA. And he was there during the Kennedy assassination, and it's often thought this is the person who put it together with Dulles. He came out with a statement that the person that he worked with was Atlee Phillips under a different name, Maurice Bishop, and that Atlee Phillips had Oswald as his go-to man, that he would have him do different jobs, etc., the same way that Bannister did. This is the drawing that he made here of the man he dealt with for years as Maurice Bishop, and that's David Atlee Phillips, who was the chief of CIA covert operations and a very dark player, but somebody who was, you know, a dedicated Cold Warrior, because after all, every justification was given. It was against Russia, so it was good for America. So this is what he wrote. This is his letter testimony at the end of his life. And that's the memo there. I'm going to read it. What it says is, Dear Marie Fonzi, and that is the widow of the great researcher, Gaeton Fonzi, you may publish the following statement from me. Maurice Bishop, my CIA contact agent, was David Atlee Phillips. So he went on the record with it. Phillips or Bishop was the man I saw with Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas in September 1963. So there's one of the kind of key CIA people who was used by the CIA to infiltrate Cuba, on the record saying the CIA chief of covert operations was with Oswald in September of 63. So it lets us understand that whatever they were doing with Oswald, they were probably saying to him, look, you can infiltrate this plot, and there's a plot against the president, and you'll be a hero, or whatever it happened to be. So they kind of move him into a corner. They're just like, you have to play along and pretend that you're a communist. And then by the time he's grabbed, there's no way for him to tell a different story because he's been playing the CIA cover game, and they grab him and use him as a patsy. That's the story that we're seeing. It's the thing that we need to understand. It gives us a much better snapshot of it. And then when we get into the why they assassinated Kennedy, once we start to look at the things that they wanted to achieve with the war machine in Vietnam, that's one, Kennedy was against it. Two, they wanted to dominate space. He wanted, first of all, an absolute ironclad no war in space policy. And two, he wanted to share all the developments and the technology developments that they got in space. And three, he wanted to share the UFO file with the Russians. That's a big problem. And we also know that he printed his own money and went around the Federal Reserve. This is somebody who wanted a new frontier. He wanted, freedom, and he wanted the United States to be the kind of beacon for the rest of the world to follow. There's a few quotes by President Kennedy in relation to space that I think would be good to close on. And of course, that's from the 100th anniversary edition of Life magazine. Life magazine famously, before the Zapruder film came out, printed the sequence of President Kennedy getting shot backwards, so people would think that all the shots were coming from Oswald shooting from behind, when in fact they were all coming from the front of the CIA assassins. No big surprise there. All right, here are the JFK quotes on space, and I think the tone of it, if we really catch the tone, we'll understand what his vision of space exploration was about, and maybe our own attitude in America towards the space program can change. Instead of space as a warfighting domain and all that stuff. Quote, "We set sail on this new sea because there is new knowledge to be gained and new rights to be won, and they must be won and used for the progress of all people. For space science, like nuclear science and technology, has no conscience of its own. Whether it will become a force for good or ill depends on man, and only if the United States occupies a position of preeminence can we help decide whether this new ocean will be addressed in a sea of peace or a new terrifying theater of war." Catch that understanding. A new terrifying theater of war. That's how he's saying space could go. This is the danger, I think, that we're looking at, and why we need to make sure that we don't have any weapons in space. Kennedy again, "We go into space because whatever mankind must undertake, free men must fully share. Humanity has to share in it, or it's useless." Jeff Bezos going up there and mining asteroids, and our friend there from Tesla, Elon Musk, going up there and saying, "I'm going to have space tourism and go to Mars and run Mars," doesn't mean anything. If you don't include the citizens who built the program, if you're not going there with mankind's aspirations, with humanity's aspirations for free men and women to fully share, it doesn't mean anything. Back to Kennedy's quote, "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth." That's where the entire space program, moon program, comes from. And just a couple of kind of key quotes from him. "However close we sometimes seem to that dark and final abyss, let no man of peace and freedom despair, for he does not stand alone. In whatever arena of life one may meet the challenge of courage, Whatever may be the sacrifices he faces if he follows his conscience, the loss of friends, his fortune, his contentment, even the esteem of his fellow man, each man must decide for himself the course he will follow. The stories of past courage can define that ingredient. They can teach, they can offer hope, they can provide inspiration, but they cannot supply courage itself. For this, each man must look into his own soul and her own soul as well. And finally, my fellow Americans, let us take that first step. Let us step back from the shadow of war and seek out the way of peace. And if that journey is 1,000 miles, or even more, let history record that we in this land at this time took that first step. That's when he signed the nuclear test ban treaty with the Russians, and that there had never been such a treaty. And that set us on a path of denuclearization. And of course, President Kennedy saved the world from nuclear conflict during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And for that, we forever owe him the debt of finding out who was responsible for removing his legacy and his work and his life. And certainly the Central Intelligence Agency has, over these past 58 years, done everything to change that story, turn it around, blame it on the Russians, blame it on the Cubans, do anything. But where the story goes simply is to the clandestine action of the Central Intelligence Agency, their grudge against this leader, and their control by the deep state to eliminate President Kennedy and later his brother. So as American citizens, we can't get around that. And as citizens of the world, the whole world is watching. So that's something that I think we need to correct. And unfortunately, the actions by the Biden administration have left us back in that same old cover-up mode. And of course, I didn't expect anything more from Biden, who doesn't seem to be in charge of that administration. And the committee that is in charge is a really dark group that I think, the more we've found out about whether it's defense secretary or his press secretary, his health and human services secretary, I mean, this is a bad bunch. So we need to use every kind of pushback tool available legislatively and with the force and with the megaphone of our intention to push back on the very fascist mandates that he's announced as well. And we have to remember that there is good leadership, and President Kennedy was the living model of it. So they were able to cut his presidency short, but the light continues. And never let it be forgot that once there was a Camelot. Everyone, thank you so much for watching. It's great to have you in here. I'm going to do a couple of shout outs there. Again, Kat Goida, thank you for running the Ideas Room. Great people in the Ideas Room are going to be taking your questions next week. Henry Souza, it's great to see you out there. Kitty Cat, Johan Wolf, a cult fan, great to see you. Plan B, Ron Fry. In the comments of this video, why don't you tell me what your impressions of John F. Kennedy are, the things that you learned from John F. Kennedy, and how important it would be to bring forward these records showing these connections to the people who assassinated President Kennedy and gave that psychic shock to this nation, one in a series of psychic shocks. And in closing, I'd like to read what Professor Peter Dale Scott has said in relation to the continuity of government group, which is something we've covered in this program before, but I think it is there in the heart of all this, where we really see that, this group, the COG group, is the one who acts completely outside the law, and the deep state action seems to always wound up with these individuals. And this is what Professor Scott has to say about COG. A common denominator for structural deep events like 9/11 and the JFK assassination, Project Doomsday, and COG. The people who operate with continuity of government are using the secrecy of this, what they call the Doomsday Network, the thing that was set up to survive any emergency. And they're using those emergency powers. And we have to remember, during this whole thing about COVID, et cetera, we keep hearing that phrase. Oh, we're using emergency powers to do this, emergency powers to lock you down, emergency powers to give you mandates. And so we need to get at this emergency aspect and also dissect it and deflate it, because they don't have those powers in the Constitution at all. So he says here, McCord's participation, and that's one of the Watergate burglars, James McCord's participation in an emergency planning system dealing with telecommunications suggests a common institutional denominator in the backgrounds of almost all the deep events we are considering. Oliver North, the Reagan-Bush point man on Iran-Contra planning, was also the National Security Council Action Officer for Project 908 planning, and thus he had access to the nation's top-secret doomsday communications network. North's network, known as Flashboard, excluded other bureaucrats from opposing viewpoints, and it had its own special worldwide anti-terrorist computer network by which members could communicate exclusively with each other and their collaborators abroad. That is a covert government, and this thing has been utilized all the way from 9/11 to the election of November 2020, when they were looking to replace and started talking openly in the press about continuity of government. I first advanced the hypothesis that the COG communications network was involved in all of our structural deep events. I found further corroborations for it. For example, John Dean, perhaps the central Watergate figure, had participated in COG activities when serving as the Associate Deputy Attorney General, and an Army Reserve officer, Norman Katz, revealed that in October 2013, because of his work in COG communications, he was summoned to Washington in November '63 in communication with President Kennedy's trip to Dallas. We have to understand the impact and the power of COG. It's literally an underground government, and that's something I think that we need to be able to bring forward. And I could go on with this all night, of course, and we'll do more shows on COG coming up, but thank you so much for joining me. A couple more shout outs: Grant Alexandra, Deborah Sloan, Gail Nelson. Oh, it's great to see so many people out there tonight. A fantastic crowd. We're going to be back with you next Friday, and as I said, we have some exciting guests coming up. And I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter, and that's going to keep us in touch with each other. It's a free newsletter. And in this era where they're just shutting people down left and right, that thing is crucial because it gives us our own direct pipeline with each other. Also, while you're there, go ahead and get behind the show and feel free to subscribe. We've made it very easy and affordable for everyone. And what else can I tell you? Someone asked me if they could come and if they could send a check for their membership. I'm going to read you the physical address that you can send that to. It's Dark Journalist, 1770 Massachusetts Avenue, number 238 in Cambridge, Massachusetts, 02140. Right by lovely Harvard Square. It's great to be here with everyone. Luke Walker, Kate Kelly, Kitty Cat. I think I said that before. That's a good name. Again, thank you, Carolyn, for running the Ideas Room. Just fantastic to see everyone tonight. We will see you all next Friday, and some very exciting stuff coming up. Hang in there. Have a great week. Deborah Blair, it's great to see you out there. Nicholas Sangaris, alien scientist. Najat Madri, great to see you. Kate Kelly, Frank Monday, how are you, sir? Melissa, thank you for being a supporter. We really appreciate it. And for those who gave super chats tonight, thank you very much. We appreciate the support, and it helps us to bring these reports to you. Grandma Tippy Toes, Gypsy Moon, Dark Truth, wow, the gang's all here. We will see you all next week, and have a fantastic evening, everyone. And it says end broadcast, but after all, it never really ends. Thanks so much, everyone. We'll see you soon.